Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving into the Eldar index once more and talking about which units in the index need the most help. Now, I know this comes off as a little bit greedy, and yeah, it kind of is, right? The Eldar are one of the best factions in the game currently. A lot of their datasheets are top-notch, and even the datasheets that aren't really being played in competitive play are quite solid. And here I am talking about which units need buffs. I know a lot of players, maybe who don't play Eldar, are going to see this video and are going to do a little bit of crying about it. But, I think that every index has units in it that need buffs, and whether, the index as a whole is doing super well, it's super competitive, or it's kind of in the dumpster, I think that internal balance is important. And what that means is that basically units that aren't performing well need to get buffs, whether the codex is competitive or not. So, Eldar could be at 80% win rate, and if they had bad datasheets in there, I would still advocate that those bad datasheets are fixed. Obviously, I also want the OP units, the super effective units that are way too good to be nerfed, but, in response, I also want some of the units in the index that aren't doing so good to be propped up. Because that's basically what internal balance is. Now, GW has hinted that they want to increase the internal balance in the game, even between indexes, so I hope that they can make good on that promise with the Aeldari as well, and not just with other factions that aren't performing so well, but with all factions in the game, and really take a deep look at each and every one. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be first looking at why internal balance is important for the game, and then we're going to be talking about the 5 Eldar units most in need of buffs. Now, I do think there are more than 5 Eldar units that could use a few tweaks here and there, but we're just going to be talking about the 5, in my view, in my mind, that are the most in need of them. All right, so why is internal balance important for the game? So basically, this is why internal balance is crucial for any game to work. It provides the player with meaningful choices when building an army. If a player is looking at an index and there's only really a couple or a handful of good options and the rest of them are not great, then that player has very limited options when it comes to army building. And let me give you an example. In 5th edition, Tyranids were arguably one of the worst armies in the game. In fact, I would argue that they were the worst army. Everything they had was extremely short-ranged, and they had barely any AP values throughout their list. So if something went into you that had a 2+ armor save, you really didn't have that many options against it except in close combat, and a savvy opponent could essentially keep you away from close combat if they wanted to with pretty hardcore shooting. As in 5th edition, it was true line of sight, and there was no such thing as obscuring terrain. So to combat this, Tyranid players basically had to spam their most competitive units. You would see lists with triple Hive Guard, triple Zoanthropes, double Winged Hive Tyrants, right? And there wasn't that much variety. You would see the minimum amount of Gaunts, and that's about it. Sometimes you would see a Turvagon, which basically gave you free Gaunts, and this was just because, you had to find a way to make up that value lost in other units. And yeah, essentially every Tyranid list looked the same. It was boring to play against, and it was absolutely frustrating to play as. And same thing goes for a lot of codexes in the past, right? I mean, a lot of you have played older codexes, you guys know what I'm talking about. So internal balance is important because it gives the player, again, meaningful choices in building their list. And it allows different competitive builds to flourish and more fun to be had. And I think I've had some of the most fun in the game when we've had a balanced index. Or codex, where I can run multiple different units and have relative success with them because they're, effective in their role. Now, I know what some of you are thinking out there. Proxy Hammer, but I don't really care about competitive play. I just play what looks cool. And even if the unit sucks, I still have fun with it. So I don't really care if units get buffed or nerfed. That's not important to my enjoyment of the game. And that's totally acceptable. That's totally fine to have that opinion. I'm not against that opinion at all. I just think that, a lot of players out there do want their units to perform well. And yeah, personally, when I play games, I've run units before that aren't great because I want to try them out. In 9th edition, I tried out Storm Guardians in several games. If you look at my videos from 9th edition, I tried out Guardian Defenders multiple times. I tried to make these units work. And yeah, I did run them, I did try them out, but after a while, it got kind of boring. And that's because bad units usually just don't have any flavor. They're not good at anything, so it's not exciting to use them. Storm Guardians in 9th edition were a nightmare. They really didn't do anything or bring anything to the table. And neither did Spirit Seers. Spirit Seers in 9th edition were awful, and they had no flavor to them. It wasn't fun to bring them because they just didn't add anything to your list. So yeah, they look cool, they're awesome, whatever it is, but, gameplay-wise, if they don't bring anything to the table, eventually they're going to get kind of stale and boring. And that's why, in my mind, internal balance is important, because we want to keep players engaged in the game and having fun with the units that they buy. Alright, so enough of that. What are the units that are the most in need of buffs? So these are the 5 that I think are most in need of buffs. The Shadow Seer, Howling Banshees, Prince Riel, Warlock Conclaves and Warlocks, and Shining Spears. Now, obviously, there are more that I can think of, like the Hemlock Wraithfighter, for example, but I chose not to talk about the Hemlock Wraithfighter in this video just because, it is a flyer, and I think its issues are more about the core rules of the game, like Battle Shock being kind of not great, versus its actual datasheet, right? So, yeah, its datasheet looks a little bit weak, but that's because its ability is, based on the core rules of the game. If Battle Shock was a really big part of the game, I think the Hemlock could be a little bit better, and obviously it would still need some tweaks. But, let me know in the comments what you guys think about the Hemlock and what you would do to improve it. Because, it is a unit that I considered in this list, but at the end of the day decided to, not include it. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Alright, so first up is the Shadow Seer. Now, the Shadow Seer is a character for Harlequins that offers no real benefits to the unit, unfortunately. So, it's a little bit more expensive than a Troop Master, yet it doesn't have a Psychic ranged attack, so it has no Psychic shooting attack, unlike every other Psyker pretty much in the Index, aside from the Spirit Seer. And of course, we know why the Spirit Seer doesn't have one. It's because the Spirit Seer is more of a defensive piece, right? It's more of a Wraith buffer. So lore-wise, it would make sense that it doesn't have a Psychic shooting attack. However, there's no excuse for the Shadow Seer. The Shadow Seer had offensive Psychic powers in 9th edition. There's no reason why it shouldn't have any in this edition. Now, it also gives the unit stealth, which isn't great, as Harlequins don't really want to be shot at, and stealth isn't really a great ability. It's not going to save your unit from getting slaughtered if they're out in the open. Of course, if they're behind obscuring terrain, it doesn't do much. And furthermore, most of the time, Quins are going to be in their transport of a Starweaver, so it's really not going to be effective, right? It's not going to affect the Starweaver with stealth, so it's, half the game not going to be activated. It also gives the unit advance and charge and can reroll the advance, but cannot use it while in a transport. So, for example, if you're in a transport at the start of the movement phase, when you're supposed to activate this ability, then you can't activate the ability. So your command phase ends, your movement phase starts, you have to immediately use the ability, and if you're in a transport, you lose that option. And let's be real here, Harlequins are mostly always going to be in some sort of transport. So it really doesn't make sense to have an ability that you can't even use outside of a transport. If they changed their wording on that a little bit so that you could use it out of a transport, it would be much more useful. So all in all, the Shadow Seer really adds nothing meaningful and costs more than a Troop Master. So you might as well just have a Troop Master, get those devastating wounds, and get a little bit of extra melee punch. So what is it that the Shadow Seer needs? Well, first of all, the ability needs to be passive so it works when disembarking from a transport, or needs to be allowed to use at any time during the battle. So that's 1. 2, it needs a Psychic shooting attack with Assault. Come on, this is a Harlequin character we're talking about. It should have some sort of shooting attack that's, Psychic based. Last edition, we had things like Mirror of the Minds, you could have something like that. So something along the lines of a Warlock shooting attack, right? Warlocks have Destructor for their shooting attack. This should have something like Mirror of the Minds. Mirror of the Minds used to be a precision attack against characters. This could very much be the same thing, right? It could be very much in line with something like Mind War, except maybe a little bit weaker than Mind War, because obviously the Shadow Seer is less points than Eldrad. And definitely shouldn't do as much damage versus characters. Or, instead replace Stealth with Lone Op for her unit. So I think if stealth went away and she just gave the unit lone operative, that would also be great. We already have this in the index with Illic. There's no reason why we can't have it with a Shadow Seer as well. And it would make sense, right? Shadow Seers of the Light Sideth used to have something along these lines. So it would fit in nicely with what we've seen before in 9th edition with Harlequins and Shadow Seers. So yeah, the Shadow Seer definitely needs some of these buffs. I think if the Shadow Seer doesn't get at least a few of these, we're going to see her on the shelf for a very long time, at least until we get her Codex. Okay, next up is Howling Banshees. Now, I know some of you out there are big Howling Banshee fans and love them, and I like them too. I'm a real big fan of the unit. I love the aesthetic. They were one of my favorite units back in 5th edition, way back in the day, even though they weren't that good back then. So, Howling Banshees. How do they work, and what do they need? So, Howling Banshees are an anti-mech close combat unit that can advance and charge and always strikes first. Now, on paper, that seems pretty good. But in practice, it's not really that great because always strikes first isn't as powerful on a unit that isn't durable or will usually be the aggressor. It's usually going to be the unit charging. Howling Banshees are never going to sit there and wait for a charge, right? The reason why the Howling Banshee mask is good on the Autarch Wayleaper is because the Autarch Wayleaper is usually in the back just sitting there and defending a point. So having always strikes first when you're defending something is useful, especially on a unit that's hard to shoot at because of lone operative. Howling Banshees are very easy to shoot at and they die very easily, so strikes first isn't that great. They are also expensive for what you get at 85 points and surprisingly don't trade well versus a lot of mech targets. On average, they kill about maybe 3 Marines on charge, which, the Marines will strike back with 6 attacks, hitting on 3+, and wounding on 3+, killing a couple in return. And that's not even accounting for the power weapons that the, unit leader might have. So, yeah, Howling Banshees most often are going to either, barely trade up against a regular squad of intercessors or actually trade down, depending on what your opponent rolls with the sergeant. And that's really just sad for a unit that used to be the premier anti-hard target killer. Now, I know that in 9th edition, they were basically anti-everything. They could kill dreadnoughts, for God's sakes, on charge. That was pretty insane. I'm not saying bring them back to those levels, but, at least make them trade better against those types of units that they're supposed to be effective against. So right now, what do Howling Banshees need in order to be effective? So right off the bat, a points drop would help. 70 points sounds about right for a unit that has trouble trading up into mech targets. And obviously, with buffs, they could be a little bit better, but you're investing more points into that. So I think 70 points is just about right for a base cost. However, if you want to keep them the same points, I think when they charge or advance, they ignore Overwatch, right? This is a very fast and acrobatic unit. When they're advancing, they're too fast to Overwatch. And when they're charging, their Howling Banshee masks are preventing you from being able to aim properly as, you have to worry about your eardrums bursting. So I think that really fits in with the fluff and the lore of the Howling Banshees as well, and it doesn't make them super OP. They're not ignoring all Overwatch, right? They're just ignoring Overwatch when they meet certain conditions. When they drop out of a transport, they can still be Overwatched just like normal. If they move normally and don't advance, they can still be Overwatched. But, when they advance and when they charge, they ignore it. So basically cannot be targeted with that stratagem. I think that would help them big time. And if this change were made, I would definitely consider them in multiple different lists. I don't think they're an auto take, even if they ignore Overwatch in these conditions, but I do think they're much more effective. All right, so moving on from Howling Banshees and moving to Iyandin's finest, and that is, of course, Prince Riel. He is a named character with a redeployment ability. He gets to redeploy 3 units in the army on the battlefield or put them back into strategic reserve, and he gives an extra OC for units he joins, which can only be Corsairs and Guardian units, but that's still pretty cool. His redeployment happens before you see who gets first turn, though, and that's one of the big things, right? The Tyranids, they get to redeploy after they know who gets first turn, so that's a much stronger ability. Prince Riel, unfortunately, does not. The extra OC is nice, but it's not why you take him, and the reason why he's really not included that much in people's armies is because he costs 100 points. Which is kind of insane for what he does and why a lot of people don't take him. Because, you can get a lot for 100 points in an Eldar index, and typically having a redeployment ability is nice, but it's not always required, and you definitely have to build your army around it, knowing that you have that ability. And also, just as far as his stats go and his combat ability goes, he really doesn't offer much more outside of what an Autarch Wayleaper does. Yeah, he has a little bit more melee damage, of course, but, it's not so much higher that you would really consider taking him as a melee beatstick. He just doesn't do that much damage. And also, the units he joins don't really want characters attached to them because they don't want big targets on their heads, right? It's the same reason you don't put a Farseer in a unit of Guardians. I know some of you guys do that with some success, but, if your opponent has any way of dealing with that unit, it makes it a much juicier target. So, Guardians don't really want him, and then Corsairs don't really want him either because Corsairs have Scout. They want to be on their own. They want to be able to scout on their own, and Prince Riel, unfortunately, does not have Scout. So, that's kind of anti-synergistic as well. So, yeah, Prince Riel has these kind of issues, and the fact that he's 100 points makes him a little bit hard to take in a list. So what does Prince Riel need in order to be effective? So something I didn't mention here, but I think he obviously needs Scout so that he can scout with Corsairs, right? I think that's the first thing. But aside from that, I think the main things are his redeployment ability needs to happen after the roll to see who gets first turn. There's really no reason why that shouldn't be the case, as GW has already shown us that they're willing to do this with armies like Tyranids. So he definitely needs a redeployment ability buff to see, who gets first turn first before being able to use it. As things stand, if they keep things exactly the same, he needs to get his points reduced to about 75. And that's tops. And the reason for this is because an Autarch on foot is 75 points and arguably does much more, right? Gives you a command point, can take, different weapon options, allows you to use a battle tactic stratagem twice, which actually can be good on units like Storm Guardians and stuff like that for a relatively low cost. Yeah, those units don't really want characters in them in the first place, but if you are going to put a character in them, an Autarch's not a bad option. Whereas Riel is just a little bit too expensive and really doesn't offer much to the unit, aside from an extra OC. So yeah, basically to sum it up, Riel either needs a significant point drop to about 75 points, or he needs his redeployment ability to simply be better. And on top of that, I would like to see him get the Scout rule. Okay, so moving on to Warlock Conclaves and Warlocks. Now, some of you guys use these with some success, and I know that they can be good. I, in fact, did a video, right, where I talked about Warlock Conclaves and using them out of Falcons, which can be extremely effective when you combine rerolls to wound with, the massive damage output of a unit of Warlocks, up close and personal. However, despite that, Warlocks do have some issues that need to be addressed, both the character versions and the Conclaves. So the single character versions are units that can buff a unit of Guardians or Wind Riders. They can join in and either give them a 6-inch advance or a -2 to enemy charges if on foot, or, the Skyrunner can ignore cover for the unit or give the unit stealth, which on paper sounds pretty good. They can also, as a conclave, act as a quote-unquote durable bodyguard for a Farseer, although in reality they really aren't that durable. They're still Eldar at the end of the day. Their shooting is effectively a heavy flamer with the psychic keyword, which is good, but it's not fantastic for the points you pay, and their melee weapons have no AP, so they really have no punch in melee against a lot of different targets. They're horribly expensive, and I think that's the main problem with them, right? I mean, let's be real here. They're really just too expensive right now for what they do. They cost 30 points per model when they're on foot and 50 points per model when they're on a bike. That is absolutely egregious. You're basically paying the same points as custodes. So just think of the most elite army, most heavily armored, most heavily armed army in the game. Their models cost about 50 points per model, right? They're elite models. You're paying just as much as that and getting a fraction of what those models get in terms of rules and abilities and combat punch. And quite frankly, there is no way in the warp itself that Warlocks should be this expensive. And I really do think they're paying a punishment for 9th edition for being so, cost effective as characters. So what do Warlocks and Warlock Conclaves need? So I basically think that they really just need a points reduction, a significant one. They should be no more than 20 points per model for Foot Conclaves and 35 points per model for Skyrunner Conclaves. I know that seems a little bit cheap to some of you guys out there looking at that, but they're really not that good for the cost. They're nothing outstanding, right? They're essentially a heavy flamer with the psychic keyword, which is a downside, by the way. And so far, we haven't seen anything that buffs psychic attacks. So, as of now, it's just something that gives people feel no pain against certain types of attacks. And they also just provide limited benefits, right? The Warlock Skyrunner is probably the only single character, whose cost is okay. The bodyguards, though, the Conclaves, their rules are just not great. Getting a permanent fortune is nice when a Farseer joins them, but a Farseer is much more durable with the Phoenix Gem, and much less expensive. The feel no pain that they have is only against psychic attacks. So the other thing you could do, and arguably I think this should have been done from the beginning, is when a Farseer is joined to the unit, Conclaves get a 5+ feel no pain against everything and not just psychic attacks. And again, it's one of those things where if you're not going to reduce the points, you might as well make the rules better, which in this case I think would be the way to go. Making the 5+ feel no pain work against everything would make the unit a lot more durable. I still don't think it'd be worth 50 points a model for Skyrunners, but it would be closer to that. Okay, so moving on to Shining Spears. So Shining Spears are a fast anti-mech hybrid melee unit that does well against most armored infantry. However, their large base sizes and the fly and mounted keywords together in this edition make it really hard for them to maneuver as a combat unit. So the reason why it's not a big deal with things like Shroud Runners is because Shroud Runners are a shooting unit. They rarely actually want to be in melee. And actually most of the time they're better used for screening because of their large bases, as in melee they only have like one attack, so they're really very ineffective in close combat. So yeah, but the Shining Spears, on the other hand, are a melee unit. They want to be in melee, so that large base size can hamper them when trying to charge over ruins and things like that. They're also extremely expensive at 120 points for 3, and as a result, don't trade well with almost anything. So you might be able to kill 3 or 4 Marines when you account for the shooting and close combat of this unit, but even so, 3 or 4 Marines are much cheaper than 120 point Shining Spears, and oftentimes as a result, it just means that these guys are going to get dumpstered immediately afterward. So what do Shining Spears need to be effective? So again, I think a points reduction would be warranted. Change them to be 90 points for 3 to allow them to make better trades. And yes, I do think they should be that much cheaper. Windriders, Shroud Runners are both 80 points. I don't see there being any reason why these guys shouldn't be around that points level. Or give their laser lances strength 5 in combat so they can at least kill toughness 4 mech equivalents reliably. And while I really think they are in just a desperate need of a points reduction, I also think that, if you did make them 100 points, gave them strength 5, that would make them hit a lot harder against certain targets and, make them worth considering in some builds. At least one unit of them. Alright, so in conclusion, I don't think there's any doubt that we have a very strong index with deep options. However, there are a few units that are stinkers amongst them and could use some love. And just like any index, right? Every index has those units in them that are stinkers that need a few buffs. That's just part of the game. And just because an index is really good doesn't mean that there aren't those stinkers lurking in it, and doesn't mean those stinkers don't deserve the same level of treatment as the underused units in the other indexes get without the greatest tournament win percentage. So, having said that, we are likely to see some significant nerfs soon to our top units, so seeing some minor buffs to bring up the bottom would also do a lot to help with list diversity. GW is always talking about list diversity and making hard choices within the game. This is the way you can do it. If you are really serious about internal balance, this is how you do it. You bring down the top units, but you also bring up the bottom units in the index. You don't bring them up too much, but you bring them up to where they're at least playable and people can enjoy them on the battlefield. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what you guys think needs buffs. And, tell me about the Hemlock Wraithfighter. Again, I know I didn't put it in this video. I wanted to keep it at 5 and even 5, but tell me what you guys think about it in the comments. Because it's definitely a unit, let's be real here, it's definitely a unit that does need some buffs. All right, thank you so much once again to all my Patreons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to become a Patreon member, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of players and enthusiasts who like talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying with all things related to the Eldar. I will leave the link for that in the description. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you guys want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on my channel store page, Eldar runes or, funny kind of Eldar memes and things like that, check that out. Or if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will also leave the link for that in the description below. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Have some great games this weekend, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.